the Podcast Movement Conference, Adswizz launches Podwave, and ad skipping. Welcome to episode 10 of the Richard Daly podcast, where I bring you a UK perspective on the latest news and developments from the world of podcasting, internet radio and online DJing. Got lots of news to talk about this week, so let's get straight into it. Now, last week I did mention the introduction of destination stats by Libsyn. Now, I really would love to be able to tell you how these are working, but unfortunately they aren't yet available in my own Libsyn account. Come on, Rob and Elsie, help me out. I really want to talk about these stats. It does seem like Libsyn are rolling this new feature out quite slowly across their network. I guess that'll keep down the strain on the network. Anyway, this week I have added SoundCloud and YouTube destinations for my podcast over at Libsyn. So I'm looking forward to being able to see statistics from those platforms straight from my Libsyn platform. Of course, once destination stats are available. When I was doing a weekly show, I did used to get a reasonable number of listens and shares by uploading the audio recording to SoundCloud. So I'm pretty hopeful that this podcast is also going to benefit from being on there. I'll report back on how I get on with SoundCloud. Looking forward to some numbers from that. Come on, Libsyn, give me those stats. News from Australia now, where a podcaster has partnered with Facebook to become the first podcasting platform to use the social network's new audio sharing technology. Now, the idea of this technology is to allow Facebook users to listen to podcasts as they scroll through their news feeds. The system's already being used by Spotify and NPR One, but Whooshkaa, that's Whooshkaa, Whooshkaa, is the first podcast company to use this technology. Now, this means that Facebook users can control the podcast by using a minimised player that overlays just a corner of the screen while they continue to scroll through their Facebook feed. At the moment, this feature is only available for podcasts hosted by Whooshkaa and apparently only works on iOS devices. Whooshkaa provide podcasters with hosting and ad injection technology. They also have advanced listener stats like many podcasting platforms, and they have their own advertising network to connect advertisers and brands with podcasters hosting their shows on their platform. Whooshkaa does host podcasts for a number of big companies already, including News Corporation, Sky News and Fox Sports, as well as many independent podcasters. Now, I think this is a different way of thinking about podcast consumption that we all need to look at. Mostly we think of podcast listeners as doing most of their listening while driving, walking, exercise, taking a bath or whatever. I guess mostly while doing those activities, it means they're not looking at their phone. And here, of course, with Whooshkaa, we're talking about encouraging listeners to consume podcasts while using their phone for something else. Now, I suspect most people are already multitasking while browsing Facebook, so I'm not really sure how successful this idea will be. I'd love to know what you think. Head over to Twitter and leave me a comment at Richard Daly. An article now from Mark Ramsey's blog, another presentation, in fact, from his HEVO conference that took place recently. This presentation was entitled "The Podcast Ad Space is Going to Explode." It features Sarah Van Mosel, who is the Chief Commercial Officer of Acast. Now, I know I've mentioned Acast on this podcast before. They're a podcast hosting company that focuses on matching podcasters with advertisers. They recently launched the product Acast Plus, which provides a paid subscription model that allows podcasters to set a price for their show, and of course also to provide additional content to those subscribers. Acast Plus also means that podcasters can provide advert-free subscriptions if they choose to their listeners. The presentation from Sarah provides an overview of podcasting for potential podcasters and advertisers that are looking to get into this space. Head on over to the show notes at richarddaly.com/10 for a link to Mark's blog and a video of the Acast presentation. Well worth a brief watch. From the HotPod newsletter this week, Adswizz, which is a digital audio ad tech company, announced the launch of Podwave. Adswizz provides leading audio publishers with its advanced server-side and client-side insertion software, and provides ad serving and supply platforms. Adswizz also operates the largest premium audio marketplace and provides advertising networks and programmatic trading solutions for online audio inventory. This is designed to be the first ad marketplace specifically created to meet the needs of podcasts. Podwave is going to provide a platform for podcasters to sell advertising slots on their shows and for advertisers to buy those slots. Now, the system aims to help podcasters and advertisers find good fits, as well as providing detailed metrics for both sides. At the moment, advertising and sponsorship of podcasts has been a difficult task for all parties, partly because of the need for direct contact to make deals, but also because of the lack of metrics. Adswizz wants to try and introduce the agency model into podcasting, which means that sales can be made to podcast networks and larger shows more easily. This, of course, is a model we're seeing more and more often in radio today and is commonly known as programmatic advertising. I see the aim of this product mostly being to reduce the cost of advertising through better targeting by podcast topic, but also helping advertisers have more faith in the metrics that podcasters provide in terms of things like listener figures. Adswizz certainly hopes that the metrics will extend to listener locations, devices and other demographics. They've partnered with National Public Media to provide this new service. Now, National Public Media, NPM, are actually the sponsorship sales team for NPR and also a number of the PBS TV stations in the US. Definitely one to watch out for. As I said, it is aimed at the bigger platforms. I don't think it will fit so well for the individual podcasts. Moving on now to the Podcast Movement. I didn't attend Podcast Movement in Chicago, but it's definitely an event I'll be looking to attend next year. I noticed there are already some early bird tickets available. It's being held in Anaheim in California in August next year. There have been lots of attendees writing about their experiences at the conference this year, but I thought I'd highlight an article from Fred Jacobs, who's the founder of Jacobs Media. In this article, Fred asks if podcasting is finally becoming a movement. Fred notes that it was his first time at Podcast Movement, but that he was excited to be in an atmosphere that radiated energy and optimism. He says audio is certainly enjoying a renaissance and podcasting is a contributing factor. And he goes on to mention an article on LinkedIn from Steve Pratt of Pacific Content. This article is called "Podcasting is having its HBO moment and its Netflix moment at the same time." Now, Pratt's article outlines the key challenges and opportunities that he sees facing podcasting at the moment. He says there's already been two waves of podcasting. The first wave was democratization of audio. This wave started way back at the beginning of the podcasting craze, when the barrier to entry was low, and basically anybody could create a podcast in their bedroom. Of course, and this is his words, this wave produced a lot of podcasts that were wild, unedited, self-indulgent, and not very good. He then goes on to talk about the second wave, the HBO and Netflix moments. And Pratt says this next wave was helped by Apple's podcast app, along with the launch of the Serial podcast. These events redefined podcasting, ushering in quality programming. Okay. Now, I know one or two of you out there might be disagreeing with that. Anyway, Pratt goes on to say that podcasts are to radio as Netflix is to TV, and that the availability of on-demand is incredibly powerful and is dramatically changing the way that consumers watch television. Jacobs Media has carried out research in this area, and they've found that there is a direct relationship between those who have become accustomed to watching their favourite shows and videos via on-demand platforms and those that are now moving in this same direction with their audio listening. And Jacobs notes in this article that the most committed podcasting and on-demand audio consumers are from the younger part of the population, and also goes on to say that many of the attendees at Podcast Movement this year are from the same group of millennials. And of course, that's what he thinks is making podcasting and this type of conference so exciting. Jacobs says, exuberance, optimism and passion are all ingredients that were very evident at Podcast Movement. So is there a downside? Well, Pratt clearly thinks there is. He views the Netflix crossover as meaning there's going to be an increasing demand for quality in podcasting. Now, the launch of Audible channels at Podcast Movement this year included a statement that their initiative is to create best-in-class audio programs. Now, Pratt's article says that many podcasts just aren't ready or can't aspire to meet these kind of standards. He says that they reflect a certain grassroots creativity that is charming, but the quest for quality and professionalism makes the space difficult to navigate. I hope you'll forgive me for the amount of quoting I'm doing here, but I want to get his words right. Now, not being able to achieve these levels of quality means that these independent podcasters are not going to be able to attract large audiences and make sustainable profits. Now, I've talked about in previous episodes Lipsin and some of their figures around independent podcasts, which still as a group make up the biggest amount of podcasts and podcast listeners out there. Pratt quotes Eric Newsom from Audible, who compares the state of the art of podcasting today to a flea market. And again, bear with me, don't scream at me through your listening device. He says, this is Newsom from Audible, you have to sift and rummage your way through a lot of rubbish in order to find content that is enjoyable and worthy of your time. Jacobs goes on to describe attending a podcast makeover session at the conference, which consisted of a live air check of a podcast show. He says that this was a good session, but that it reinforced the idea that many podcasters have a great deal to learn about show preparation, techniques for interviewing, for editing, and the other fundamentals that are key to creating compelling audio content. Now, what I want to say at this point is that clearly Jacobs comes from a background in the radio industry, And it does seem like his view is being affected by that in terms of what he expects in terms of quality of podcasts. I think we know that many independent podcasters put a lot of time and effort into producing the best podcasts they can. And certainly here in the UK, there are a number of companies and individuals that provide services to podcasters to help them in this area. Here I'm thinking of people like Mike and Isabella Russell from Music Radio Creative, Kevin Fields from the Radio Skills for Podcasters podcast, Colin Gray, who's at thepodcasthost.com, and Colin Denunt of New Rise Digital Media. And of course, there are many others. If you're in the UK and you're not already a member, I do suggest you join the UK Podcasters group on Facebook, which is a great place to interact with podcasters of all kinds. Lots of dedicated ones, lots of new ones, all interacting there on Facebook. Anyway, so I'm going to wrap this discussion on quality up by saying I think it's unreasonable to expect all podcasts to be of professional radio quality, and many independent podcasters have very successful shows that don't have some of the fundamentals that radio professionals might expect. I'm aware, and I've said it before myself, that my own podcast still needs much improvement, and I'm aiming to build that quality over time as I get more experienced in podcasting. It's not going to happen overnight, I understand that. An article from Medium now, and I think this is the first time I've mentioned Medium on the podcast. Brian Moffat writes an article called In Defence of the Dynamic Podcast Ad. Now we'll start off by saying that Brian works for National Public Media, who I've mentioned earlier. They sell corporate sponsorship for NPR and parts of PBS, as I said. And that maybe affects the rest of the article. Brian also attended Podcast Movement this year, and he notes that the bigger podcasters and networks like NPR, Midroll, Panoply and Podcast One were all in attendance. But so were lots and lots of up-and-coming podcasters, podcast networks, and many different vendors. Now, he sees this as a good sign that podcasting is growing up into a proper industry. Brian reports on a talk that Lex Friedman of Midroll gave on the basics of podcast monetization. Friedman believes that the new dynamic podcast ad insertion technology that we're starting to see could disrupt the current favourite style of host-read mid-roll advertising spots, and these will make podcasts sound more like commercial radio stations cluttered by less relevant adverts. Now that's something I'm not sure I agree with. I'm not a great fan of host-read advertising, but done well it's okay, but often it's not done to the best of quality. Brian argues that while host-read endorsements in podcasts are very effective, he doesn't necessarily see ad insertion as all bad. Of course, as we've disclosed already, Brian works for NPM, who've been inserting pre-show ads for NPR for many years, and there are several companies already offering ad insertion services. Now, of course, we're starting to see podcast-focused companies like Acast and PRC building podcast-specific platforms to serve these kind of ads automatically. What I found really interesting about this article is that Brian doesn't see listener figures being impacted by ad insertion, as long as the sound quality of those ads is as good as the podcast itself, which mirrors what I was saying about the host-read quality. The final point made in this article is that dynamic ad insertion is essential for the podcast industry to grow. Now, of course, this is focused on the bigger podcast networks and rather leaves behind the huge number of independent podcasters. So what are they to do? Well, I think the key here is to take on board the point being made about quality. If you're going to use host-read advertising yourself, then you must make sure the quality is excellent and that what you're advertising is relevant to your audience. But at the end of the day, host-read adverts are very effective, so keep doing them. A bit of an aside now. A few weeks ago, I mentioned a conversation I had at the New Media Europe conference about how conferences and other events can be difficult for introverts. I thought I would give a quick mention to an article I came across this week on the Get Response blog. This article is called The Introvert's Guide to Surviving and Thriving at a Conference, 5 Tips by Aaron Orendorff. I'll read out the introduction to the article and let you read the rest yourself. It's that time of year again, an annual season that strikes terror into the hearts of introverts the world over. Conference time. Few experiences are as terror-inducing for introverts than being thrust into a swelling crowd and told, "Here, go be social." As I said, I'll let you discover the 5 tips in the article for yourself. You can find a link to the article in the show notes for this episode at richarddalley.com/10. An article from the American newspaper The Wall Street Journal now, titled "Podcasting Has an Ad-Skipping Problem Too." This article by Stephen Perlberg compares the ad-blocking software which many people use on their desktop internet browsers today with the 15-second skip buttons that most podcast listening software have. Now, at the end of the day, this article is really about the favourite podcast topic of recent months. The difficulties of measuring audiences. The article makes the point that advertising growth in podcasting has been limited by the lack of listening metrics, and that advertisers are also worried about how easy it is for listeners to skip adverts. And of course, with a lack of metrics, it's difficult to know how many adverts are being skipped. The author of the article spoke to Stephen Smike, Chief Executive of Performance Bridge, which buys adverts on behalf of podcast marketers such as razor supplier Harry's. Mr. Smike said that skipping is definitely on their radar, so he prefers if ads are an odd length. Now, I think this is really interesting. He says 50 seconds is better than 60 seconds. You don't want to lose 15-second increments because that 15-second skip button hurts you. I know already this week I've talked a lot about podcast advertising, and this article notes that the two most common types of adverts used in podcasts are promotions read by the hosts and spots that sound similar to traditional radio adverts. Smike says that advertisers prefer the host-read adverts because they can weave marketers' messages into the programme and are much less likely to be skipped. The article then delves into some listening figures provided by Matt Lieber from Gimlet Media for a recent episode of their podcast, Reply All, where apparently 85% of listeners who began to listen to the programme on Spotify were still listening by the 12th minute of the show. At about the 16th minute, when the ad break started, the audience dipped to 77% of the original listeners. It then bounced back to about 85% after the ad finished. Now that's some sophisticated metrics if you think about it, how that must have been measured by Spotify. So do go and read the full Wall Street Journal article, as it does contain some more industry figures commenting on this topic and about podcast measurement in general. Well worth reading. Again, go to the show notes at richarddalley.com/10 for a link to the article. Events that I'm attending over the next few months now. Still, the key event I'm looking to go to is James Cridland's next radio conference on the 19th of September in London. I'm looking for other events to attend, so if you do come across something you think I should be at, do let me know. I am strongly considering picking up an early bird ticket for Podcast Movement for next year. That's already in August 2017. So that's all from the Richard Daly podcast for this week. If you visit my website at richarddalley.com, you will find all my social media links as well as the various ways you can listen and subscribe to this show. The show notes for this episode are at richarddalley.com/10. Do send me your questions or comments, and if there is a topic you would like me to cover, then please tweet me. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode.